When you're working with sound design for immersive audio, a lot of times you're limited in how you can work because a lot of times most of the tools that you're using are designed for either mono or stereo sound design, which means that inevitably the way that you're sound designing in immersive is that you're taking these mono and stereo elements and you're kind of panning them around in the immersive sound field. But what if you want to sound design directly for an immersive format? You don't want to just take mono and stereo elements and pan them around. You actually want to be able to design within the sound field. Well, that's where a tool set like the plugins from Audio Brewers come in. So we're going to be looking at 4 plugins, Audio Brewers vortEx, Astrometry, Delay and Reverb, and looking at how these plugins can enable you to take your sound design into that immersive world. And you can actually start manipulating and controlling your sound in a 3D sound field rather than just in a stereo sound field. So we're going to dive in and look at a Dolby Atmos session in Nuendo to look at that. So let's dive in here and kind of look at how the session is going. Now again, this is Dolby Atmos, but for the purposes of this video, everything is going to be presented in 2-channel binaural so that you can get some of the experience on YouTube. So in order to get that experience, you'll need headphones. So grab those headphones now and let's dive into the session and kind of talk about what we're looking at here. Okay, so the first thing to understand with Audio Brewers plugins is that they're actually based on Ambisonics. Now, if you've worked with Dolby Atmos, you'll know that Dolby Atmos doesn't kind of natively, inherently support Ambisonics. However, fortunately, Nuendo makes it really easy for us. So I'll just point out here we have our vortEx and Astrometry track. These are both third-order ambisonic tracks, which you can see right here. And when we route these to our Dolby Atmos bed, it's actually really convenient because Nuendo will automatically do the conversion into ambisonics for us. We don't have to worry about that. Or sorry, out of ambisonics. It will convert the ambisonics to the 712 that our bed is using, which is really helpful. It makes it very easy to work with ambisonics in a Dolby Atmos session. Just that conversion is done automatically. If you're working in another DAW that doesn't do that conversion automatically, you'll just need some kind of plugin like Pentio or Blue Ripple, or even Audio Brewers themselves have decoding plugins that can take ambisonics and convert it into 7.1.2 for your Dolby Atmos bed. But if you're also working directly in ambisonics for something like, say, YouTube VR, spatial audio for YouTube VR, then you can just slap the ambisonics plugins in there and just work natively in ambisonics. Now, the other thing to point out is that most of these plugins support up to 7th order ambisonics, which is a very high level of resolution and detail. Nuendo only supports up to 3rd order ambisonics, so we're working with 3rd order ambisonics, so just keep that in mind. This isn't the maximum resolution that you can theoretically get. Even, online distribution, even something like Facebook 360 is only 2nd order ambisonics. So you may not always use those, but the plugins do go up to 7th order. So if you're working with a very, very big array where you need a high level of detail, or you're working for a very high fidelity binaural type stuff, you can get a very high level of spatial resolution from these plugins, which is really cool. Okay, so in this session here, you can see I've got 3 examples, so we'll go through them one at a time. So the first one here is this ambient, kind of sci-fi ambient loop. I'll give you a look at what that sounds like, but you can see from this channel, this is just a stereo track, so just 2 channels. I'll play a bit of that for you. So this is from Synthetic Ambience Pack, and this is something you can download. If you're a supporter on Patreon, you can download all of the sound effects that are on there, including this one as well as another one I'll show you in a second that I'm using for this demo. So if you like the sound of it, go join my Patreon. But this is a series of ambient sounds that I did that were all done with synthesizers. So Synthetic Ambiences was the name of the pack. Because they were all done with synthesizers, they were all stereo. So we kind of want a way to take that stereo and kind of, expand it out into the immersive sound field. Now, you could do that with just an upmixing plugin, something like Pentio I've done videos on in the past. And that's a really powerful tool because if you want a really equal, even balance that's kind of very enveloping and fills out the whole space, that's a great way to do that. but it's not very interesting from kind of a sound design creative perspective. So that's where something like Audio Brewer's vortEx comes in. So this is what vortEx looks like, and at its core, you could say that vortEx is a reverb plugin, but that would be kind of a very reductive way to describe it, because you will see some controls that look familiar from a reverb perspective. You know, space, time, damping, pre-delay are all things that you would typically see on a reverb plugin. But then you see stuff like viscosity or buoy or definition, and it kind of raises the question of what are all of these things? So let's just start from the start, and I'll see, we can select our input here. In this case, we're sending a stereo source to this, and then we're outputting Ambisonics. You can see we can control our input here. We can treat it kind of like two stereo channels right in front of us, or we can treat it kind of like spread out all around us just from the get-go or anywhere in between. We're going to stick with this discrete here. And then also on our output, you can see we have this width control to kind of control the total sound field. We're just going to keep it kind of the default there. And like any other reverb plugin, we have a dry control, so we can send some of the dry through. We're using this on a bus, so I'm going to turn the dry down all of the way. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to play this, and again, we have this on an aux bus, so we're sending here from our track to our bus. I'm just going to slowly bring up this bus, and you can kind of hopefully hear how it kind of starts to fill out the sound field just to get kind of an idea of what that's like. Okay, so this is really nice. I intentionally, when I design these sound effects, I intentionally design them to be a bit dry. They don't really have much natural reverb on them, which means when we add some of that space and reverb with this vortEx plugin, it just kind of fits together and melds together and just becomes really enveloping and fills out the whole space. Now, to go through some of the controls, so space is fairly, understandable. Space controls the size of the environment, so you can go for a very dry sound, a very, big reverb sound. And as you can see, if we set this to 100%, that freezes the sound, which in this case means essentially it's infinite decay. The reverb will never stop. So if you just want to kind of create a sound with that, so if I set this to 100 and I'm just going to play back a bit and then stop it, it's just continuing to go, which can be cool for developing a very interesting, unique kind of ambient sound. You can just freeze it and it'll just play continuously, and you constantly get that that kind of character. So in this case, we're not doing that. We're just gonna have a kind of a normal reverb sound, and then our time here is our decay time. Again, we can go from a very short up to a very, very long decay. So I'll kind of show you what that sounds like. So you can see it takes quite a long time to decay. And then other stuff that's fairly typical, damp, is just the control of the high frequencies. So if you have a very, very hard room, a marble tiled room, it would have very little damping, versus if you had a bedroom or something with lots of curtains and furniture and stuff, it would have very high damping. Pre-delay, again, is just the initial delay before the reverb kicks in. That's really standard reverb stuff. And then we have a buoy. The buoy is kind of the same version as this presence, discrete versus omnipresent, but it's doing it on the tail end instead of the initial part. And I really like it. I'll show you what it sounds like with a low buoy. It's very front focused, remains very front focused. With the high buoy, everything starts to kind of fill out and become very enveloping. And I really like the way it sounds. It's a really great way to just make everything super enveloping. So I'll kind of show you what that does. And you can hear just how enveloping, you can really feel, with the zero buoy, it starts just up here in front of you, and then it really just slowly starts to fill out and just become totally enveloping, which is really, really awesome. I really love the way that that works. And then the definition kind of controls how clear individual points are. So for this, it doesn't really make sense, but if you were using this where you had like very distinct sound sources in different locations, the definition would kind of help to create very clear, defined sources in the reverb. So that's not too applicable for this, but just to point out what that does. And then we also have a wet control. This just controls the overall volume of the wet signal, so fairly typical. And we also have an EQ here, so we can use that to control the tone of the sound, pretty standard. We have a spatial control, which lets us rotate both horizontally and vertically the sound field, which can be very helpful. And then we have these meters down here. And then we also have kind of what makes this interesting for sound design is these mods down here. Now these are something you would see more typically in a synthesizer plugin. These are basically LFOs, and these allow us to, as you can see, what happens when I enable them is we now have LFOs applied to these different spots. So we have 4 LFOs here. We can control the time of the modulation on each one. And then you can see down here, this little bar lets us control the range that we're modulating over. And these little buttons here just let us apply each of those mods to different parameters. So you can see pretty much all of our parameters allow us to modulate them. This isn't the most advanced modulation. It's only a sine wave LFO, and the range is kind of individual for every single control. Something more sophisticated, synthesizer plugin would have generally more controls than this. You could set up a square wave or a sawtooth oscillator. Most soft synths have a lot more controls, but these are typically controls you only see on a soft synth. So to see them on a reverb plugin is kind of cool because we get that additional modulation. So I've already kind of set up some modulation here. As you can see, everything is kind of moving. So I'll just play it back and you can kind of hear how this is taking this from just a regular reverb plugin to something that's actually manipulating and creating the sound, which is the whole point of sound design. So you can see we're kind of adding these additional textures and elements, which is really interesting. I'll point out this viscosity here because I don't think I really explained that before. This viscosity controls how quickly these parameters react when we change the parameters. And kind of to demonstrate that, I'll actually turn off the mods here. We actually have this control in the middle, which you may have seen, and this actually controls, as you can see, a number of parameters. So this gives us kind of an interesting way. We can just kind of move this around and manipulate a bunch of parameters simultaneously. And this viscosity controls how quickly those react. So I'll kind of mess with this and change the viscosity so you can see how that kind of sounds different and changes. So we're getting those different textures, and you can hear with the higher viscosity, it reacts more slowly, which gives us kind of a different, interesting type of texture and reaction, which is really, really cool and interesting that we get that level of control. So now let's move on to our second demo here with Astrometry. Now, vortEx is kind of a reverb plugin, but kind of taking it into, the third dimension and then adding all these sound design elements. Astrometry is kind of the same thing, but with delay. So you can see we have a bunch of delay taps. Looks like at first glance a reasonably common, multi-tap delay. But again, we get into all of the elements that make this a really cool, powerful tool for sound design. So to mess with this, I've got another recording here. This is from a different set of sound effects I did, which were commercial planes, recording on the interiors of commercial planes. So I'll play a bit You can see I've got Astrometry turned down right now. So I'll play, this is just a bit of just the generic recording, and you can also see this recording is in first order ambisonics. So this should be fairly enveloping already. There's really nothing too fancy about this. It sounds like sitting in the cabin of a plane. So now let's bring in Astrometry and see how we can kind of make this go a little crazier. And even as I've stopped it, it just keeps going. We have quite a long delay here, so I'll actually just turn it down there, let it die out. So you can see with this delay, we're starting to get, all these kind of textures and elements and getting this additional comb filtering that's kind of adding some interesting dynamic to it. And you can see here, again, we have all these taps. And with each of these taps, you'll see some controls that look familiar with our last plugin. First, we have a feedback, I should add, which is just a generic, feedback for a delay. That should be pretty typical. We have this plus and minus, which lets us control the number of delay taps, up to 8 taps. We've got wet, volume, mix volume, spatial control, and then on each individual tap, we've got a viscosity, which we kind of talked about, and you can actually see the viscosity is visually represented here. We also have the capability to do serial delays, in which case each delay kind of goes from one to the next, or we can set them up as parallel, where the tap is kind of acting independent of all the other taps. So right now we have them all set in serial, so each tap is kind of going one after the other. And then using this graph here, we can control each individual tap. So left to right axis is our time delay, and then up and down is our volume. So I'm actually going to shorten this up quite a bit because, like I said, these are all in series, which means they're all running one after another. And we have some different viscosities here. So let me just play a bit of that. Oh, it's actually turned down. There we go, add that in. Get that interesting dynamic. And then you can also see as that continues to go and it will eventually die out, that we also have this button here, which allows the sounds to spatialize. Really, the one thing I don't like about this plugin is that you can't manually spatialize each tap, but you can randomize each tap. So if we hit this button here, actually we'll hit the dynamic constellation and then we'll hit recalculate. Every time you hit recalculate, it moves those points around. So let me just hit that a couple times. So it's not super obvious, but hopefully you can hear each of those taps is moving around as we hit that reset button. So you don't get manual control, but you can hit reset to your heart's content until it kind of fills out the space the way you want. And then just like vortEx, we have our mods. So you can see I've got some kind of crazy stuff going on here. So we'll just throw some stuff in here and kind of see what happens. It's a little crazy. We'll just kind of see what that does to the sound. Okay, that's enough of that. But you can see now that we're adding in this movement with these modulations, again, they work just the same way as vortEx. Now we're suddenly getting this dynamic, interesting thing, and we're totally changing the shape of the sound. So if I wanted to take this, realistic, authentic recording of a plane, because it was recorded on a plane, on an actual plane, and turn it into something, interesting, unique, sci-fi, I can just slap astrometry on there, and now suddenly I'm taking this, realistic sound and I'm turning it into something unique and interesting. And I'm already in, a whole immersive field. It's not like I'm taking this and I'm just, doing some manipulation with a stereo file and then I have to like upmix it to immersive. I'm actually working in immersive from the get-go, which makes this a really great way to translate to those immersive formats. Now I've got one last demo here, and this demo is less kind of on the creative side of sound design and more on the practical side of sound design, if you will. So we're going to look at Audio Brewer's Delay and Reverb, which are kind of the more standard versions of Astrometry and vortEx, if you will. The Astrometry and vortEx are kind of these extreme special sound design type stuff. Delay and reverb are just delays and reverbs, but again, they work up to 7th order ambisonics, which is really cool. So same situation, I've got a recording here. This is a recording of some horns playing the Star Spangled Banner. So let me just mute our effects tracks. I'll just play that real quick. So this is a fairly dry recording of some horns playing the national anthem. I want to make it sound like they're in a big stadium. So how am I going to do that? Well, let me just show you my routing here real quick. First, I've got two sends. I've got to send directly to the reverb, and then I've got to send to this FUTS track. This FUTS track here is doing some manipulation. It's some distortion, some EQing, some resonance to make it sound like it's being played through a sound system. So, and I've got that on a pre-fader send. So if I turn this down, we can hear just the FUTS. Maybe. Oh, I actually have it sent directly to the delay, so we can't hear it without the delay. Let me slap the delay here, and this is just a generic delay. So you can see it's a bit filtered, a bit distorted. And with this delay plugin, it's really cool because we have actually this should be, sorry, that should be, I just noticed a stereo element, not an ambisonics element. I messed that up. And it should look familiar to vortEx. So we've got these input and output controls, and then we've got our dry control. And then we can have on here up to 4 taps of our delay. And these are fairly typical taps. We've got a high pass and a low pass filter on each one. Rate, so just how long the delay is. Feedback, our wet control. And then we can pan them. So we actually have a horizontal and vertical pan that lets us individually pan each tap. So I've got one panned up here, and then in this kind of similar positions behind us, and each with a slightly different delay. And then again, we have an option to do parallel or serial, depending on which we want. And again, this is just standard delay, but it's again in fully immersive format. And we're just using this to create the sound of kind of a delay going to, speakers. If you think about something like a baseball stadium, you're down on the field, the speakers are a long ways away and they're facing back in. So you're going to get this very long, kind of open, big delay sound. So I'm just going to play this without our send to our FUTS and then our delay. And then I'm just going to bring it in so you can hear we suddenly go from this dry studio sound to this big stadium sound. And then the last big part of this is reverb, as you can probably guess. This is, again, just a standard reverb. Really, the only thing special here is you can see we have freeze controls, which, again, just freezes the reflections and gives us an infinite decay time. But other than that, it's a pretty standard reverb plugin, just, again, fully 3D immersive. So we've got a size control. We've got a volume control. We have separate controls over our early and late reflections. We have a pre-delay, damping, density, which is kind of the number of reflections, if you will. Then we have EQ, and then we have the ability to kind of manipulate this on the spatials front. So pretty standard, what you might expect from a reverb plugin. I'll show you just kind of this is kind of an outdoor reverb preset. Kind of the way to get a good outdoor reverb sound is very little damping, very low density. This control sometimes has other names on other plugins, but something equivalent to this that controls the number of individual reflections, low damping, low density, fairly small size, and then a pretty long pre-delay is kind of the secret sauce to get a quick and dirty outdoor reverb sound. So if we now unmute this, I'll go ahead and play, and you can see we're sending directly from our track, and then we're also sending from our delay to our track. So you could think about, you're going to hear some reverb that's coming from our dry sound directly from the source, and also the speakers, the sound from the speakers is going to kind of bounce around. And the cool thing, because I have this on a pre-delay, I can control this dry sound kind of independently from our wet sound. And I'll mess with this a little bit here when I play this back, but I just want to kind of show you what this enables you to do is to kind of, if you were cutting together a scene, you could fairly quickly jump perspective. So if you had some shots that were down on the field and then jumping to some shots, way up in the stands, you could very quickly, all you have to do is just change this gain and it'll change the sound on the perspective. And like I said, I'll kind of manipulate this while I'm playing it back just so you can hear how that works and how you could use that to build that sound design. So first we're going to start without reverb. We're going to add in the reverb, and then I'm going to show you kind of the close and distant changes we can do. Cool. So hopefully that gives you an idea how you can do that. And that actually might be a helpful tip, even if you aren't using these plugins. If you ever run into that kind of scenario, now you know how to set up a session to be able to do that. But really, these plugins are just super powerful. They sound solid, and they give you just so much ability to just immediately, take sound up into Ambisonics, up into Immersive, and really do something fairly, realistic and authentic, like I just showed here, or something more unique and creative, depending on the type of sound that you're really kind of trying to go for. So it gives you a ton of flexibility, which is really cool, and I really appreciate. And Audio Brewers has not only these plugins, but a ton of other plugins, even things like, chorus effects, where it's a chorus effect, but in Immersive. So giving you that flexibility to not just design in mono and stereo and just pan it around or upmix it, but actually sound design for Immersive, which is really powerful. And hopefully, these tools start to become more available and more common because this is a much more powerful way to work than kind of the traditional workflow. So anyway, that's it for this video. If you want to try out any of those plugins, I'll leave links in the description, of course. And then again, if you want to use any of the sound effects I used in this, the Star Spangled Banner recording is not mine. It's a public domain recording, but I'll also link it as well as my recordings if you want to support me and download those field recordings, as well as many, many other sound effects. You can do that in the description. But that is it for this video. So if you like this video, if you learned something useful, hit that like button. If not, feel free to hit the dislike button. If you have any questions or comments, leave those down in the comment section down below. And as always, if you want to see more videos like this one, definitely hit that subscribe button.